What if I told you that one of history's greatest empires, the mighty Achaemenid Persia, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus, was brought to its knees not by external invasion, nor by civil war among legitimate heirs, but by a single, audacious lie? A lie so grand, so meticulously crafted, that it fooled millions, destabilized an entire continent, and rewrote the course of ancient history. His name was Gaumata. Or at least, that's what we are told. A humble median Magus, a nobody from the empire's periphery, who dared to look into the eyes of a stunned crowd and declare, "I am Bardiya. I am the son of Cyrus the Great. I am your rightful king." Consider this. A prince whom the reigning emperor, Cambyses II, had secretly, brutally, and irrevocably murdered months earlier. A dead man, resurrected by the will of an impostor, ascended the throne of the most powerful nation on earth. This was no mere political coup. It was a psychological operation of unprecedented scale. A theatrical masterpiece of deception that exploited the deepest fears and aspirations of a people worn down by tyranny. Gaumata didn't just seize power. He became the ghost of the murdered prince, a living phantom walking among mortals, clothed in the raiment of legitimacy. And the empire, it believed him. It wanted to believe him. The stage was set for an unparalleled drama, where the lines between truth and illusion blurred, and the very air vibrated with a desperation that made the impossible real. To truly grasp the audacity of this deception, we must delve into the shadows that birthed it, exploring the very soil from which such a monstrous lie could grow. We've already discussed how a grand lie, woven by a median Magus, brought one of antiquity's greatest empires to its knees, forcing millions to believe the unthinkable. But who was this man, this Gaumata, who dared to defy fate itself and the laws of the universe? What abyss lay hidden in his soul? What fire burned in his eyes as he gazed upon a world ready to be torn apart? To understand the scale of his deception, we must plunge into the misty past, into the very depths of time, to find the origins of his monstrous yet brilliant resolve. Gaumata, a name that became synonymous with deceit, but behind it lay not just a charlatan, but perhaps one of history's greatest psychological manipulators. He was not a prince, nor a military commander, nor even a high-ranking nobleman. He was a magus, a priest, a representative of the Median tribe, once conquered by the Persians. Herein lies the key to his motivation. Imagine, your culture, your religion, your identity, all trampled under the boot of the conqueror. You serve those who stripped you of your former glory, who dictate their laws to you. In such an environment, not only submission is born, but also a burning, smoldering flame of resentment, a thirst for revenge, a desire to reclaim lost dignity. Gaumata likely absorbed this pain of his people from a young age, this quiet hatred of Persian dominance. He was an observer, an analyst. In his mind matured not just vengeance, but something far more subtle and destructive, a desire to exploit the enemy's weaknesses, their own pride, their blindness. The empire in which Gaumata grew and formed was not merely powerful, it was rotting from within. On the throne sat Cambyses II, son of the great Cyrus, but he had not inherited his father's wisdom. Cambyses, obsessed with paranoia and a craving for absolute power, turned the court into an arena for his cruel amusements. He was a tyrant whose hand trembled with rage and whose mind was clouded by suspicion. Sources whisper of his madness, the murder of his own brother Bardiya, the execution of officials on the slightest suspicion, the desecration of Egyptian shrines, uncontrolled drunkenness and violence. While Cambyses was bogged down in Egyptian campaigns, leaving Persia at the mercy of his satraps, the people groaned under the burden of his absence and cruel decrees. The economic situation was paradoxical. On one hand, untold riches flowed into the capital, fueling the elite's luxury. On the other, these riches were acquired through the blood and sweat of millions, oppressed and driven to despair. The poverty of the common people, contrasting with the satiety and debauchery of the court, created fertile ground for discontent. Cruelty was the norm. A human life was worth nothing if it stood in the way of the powerful's ambitions. In this atmosphere of fear, hypocrisy, and despair, where any day could be one's last, Gaumata did not merely survive. He learned. He learned to read faces, to discern hidden motives, to understand how mass psychology worked, how easy it was to sow seeds of doubt, and how even easier it was to cultivate hope. He saw how people clung to any straw, any glimmer of light in the utter darkness. And then came that fateful moment, that point of no return, when Gaumata understood. His hour had come. This moment, this spark that ignited the fire, was the news of the secret murder of Bardiya, the legitimate heir, Cambyses' brother. A prince whom the people loved, and on whom they placed all their hopes. Cambyses, fearing competition for the throne, ordered Bardiya's elimination, doing so in the deepest secrecy. But secrets in an empire of such scale, even the bloodiest ones, rarely remain buried forever. Rumors, whispers, conjectures, all seeped through the palace walls, reaching the ears of those who knew how to listen. Gaumata, possessing an astonishing resemblance to the murdered prince, or at least skillfully exploiting this similarity, realized the magnitude of the opportunity before him. He didn't just hear of Bardiya's death. He saw the void this death left in the hearts of the Persians, a void that could be filled. This was not just a plan. It was an act of brilliant foresight. He understood that the empire, exhausted by Cambyses' tyranny, didn't just want to believe in the prince's resurrection. It needed it. It needed a symbol, hope, a legitimate ruler who would end the madness. The moment this thought crystallized in his mind, Gaumata crossed the line. He could not turn back. He was no longer just a magus, a priest, a median nursing a grievance. He became the architect of the greatest deception that was about to turn the world upside down. He became Bardiya. And this step, this leap into the abyss, was dictated not only by personal ambition or median revenge. It was born from a deep understanding of human psychology, the despair of the masses, and the blindness of power. And it was this understanding that became his main weapon, what allowed him to build his house of cards that would reach unprecedented heights. But every house of cards has its fulcrum, and how it held on to that fulcrum, and what intrigues he wove to keep from collapsing. That is an entirely different, no less captivating story. So the curtain rose. On stage, Gaumata, not merely an imposter, but a living phantom, the embodiment of Persia's deepest hopes and fears. His ascent to the throne was no accident. It was a carefully planned, multi-layered psychological operation, worthy of textbooks on mass manipulation. He didn't just take the place of the murdered Bardiya. He became his idealized shadow, the version of the prince the suffering people dreamed of. His first brilliant move, immediately after seizing power, was the unprecedented announcement of a tax exemption. For 3 years, the entire empire, from Sardis to Bactria, was freed from state taxes and military levies. Imagine the echo of this news. It spread faster than the wind, like a sip of life-giving water in the desert. People who had groaned for years, under the weight of imperial levies and the arbitrary rule of satraps, suddenly felt relief. This step was not just a populist gesture. It was a blow struck at the very foundation of Cambyses II power. It instantly neutralized potential pockets of resistance, buying the loyalty of millions. The people, suffering from poverty and violence, suddenly saw a savior, a deliverer, in the new Bardiya. Their faith in him became a shield, impenetrable to any attempts at exposure. But this seeming benevolence was only part of a grand strategy. While the people rejoiced, Gaumata, acting with cold calculation, began methodically building his new vertical of power. He didn't just remove the undesirable. He created a system where his decisions would be unquestionable. Those who showed even the slightest doubt faced swift and ruthless reprisal. He acted quickly, while Cambyses was still alive, though far away, and unable to dispute his authority. Every day Gaumata spent on the throne strengthened his position, transforming a daring lie into a reality that everyone was forced to accept. He became a master of playing on contrasts, Cambyses' cruelty versus his own feigned mercy, the former king's paranoia versus his supposed openness. He played on the heartstrings of everyone, from the farmer to the nobleman, and this symphony of submission grew louder and louder. However, like any meticulously planned scheme, this one also had its vulnerabilities. The most dangerous of these was not the outside world, but the inner circle, those who knew Bardiya for real, and first and foremost, his wives. To prevent any exposure, Gaumata imposed the strictest rules. None of his wives, among whom were the genuine Bardiya's spouses, could leave the palace grounds. Furthermore, they were forbidden to communicate even with each other. He kept them in a golden cage of luxury and solitude, hoping that their isolation would preserve his secret. This was an act of desperate control. An attempt to lock the truth behind the harem walls. But it was here, in the very heart of his power, that the seed of doubt was sown. One of Bardiya's wives, Fatima, daughter of the noble Persian Otanes, was a perceptive and observant woman. Perhaps she noticed something subtle, a wrong gesture, a changed gaze, or simply the absence of the intimate connection she had shared with the real prince. Or perhaps she was alarmed by his unusual behavior, his avoidance of close contact, his constant presence in shadow or behind a screen. Gaumata's paranoia, his drive for isolation, only intensified her suspicions. He strove to be Bardiya in every way, but even the smallest detail could betray him. Fatima became a silent but formidable witness, whose observations could explode this entire house of cards. It was at this moment, intoxicated by apparent impunity, that Gaumata made a fatal mistake, typical of any tyrant who has been at the top for too long. He began to revel in his power. His caution gave way to arrogance. He became less secretive, more ostentatious in his luxury and his commands. The Median Magus, posing as an Achaemenid, gradually shed the mask of humility he wore at the beginning of his reign. He began to act as a true king, but not as Bardiya, but as Gaumata, imperious, self-important, forgetful of the fragility of his lie. Perhaps he had come to believe too strongly in his own legend, dissolving into the image he himself had created. This blossoming arrogance manifested in small details. In the change of his manners, in his attitude towards courtiers, in his carelessness, when he perhaps lingered a little longer than usual, without a head covering or veil, concealing his ears, or their absence, if the most scandalous versions are to be believed. He became less attentive to details that could betray him, for he believed that no one would dare challenge him anymore. He was at the peak of his power, and at this moment his only enemy became his own excessive pride. He forgot that even the most brilliant illusion cannot last forever if someone from within begins to see through it, and that the secret threads of conspiracy had already begun to weave in the shadows of palace intrigues, where the true players were already preparing to make their move. The initial earthquake of Gaumata's deception shook the very foundations of Achaemenid Persia, but beneath the surface, the tectonic plates of power had been shifting for years, preparing the ground for this monumental upheaval. This was no mere fraud by an ambitious Magus, no. Behind Gaumata stood an entire network of shadows, whispering conspirators whose motives were as ancient as the mountains of Media themselves, and as sharp as a Persian dagger. Imagine Media, once a mighty empire, fallen under the onslaught of Cyrus the Great. Its pride was trampled, its kings overthrown, its priests, the Magi, had lost some of their influence, though they remained revered. For centuries, they harbored resentment, a smoldering ember beneath the ashes of Persian dominance. And then, Cambyses' madness, his impious deeds in Egypt, his paranoia that destroyed even his own brother Bardiya, opened a window of opportunity. For the Median elite, for the priestly class, for those who dreamed of a return to former glory, Gaumata was not just an impostor. He was an instrument, an embodiment of hope. They saw in him their chance to regain influence, perhaps even to restore the Median dynasty under the guise of a rescued Bardiya, who would, in essence, be a puppet in the hands of Median advisors. Their gain? The restoration of privileges, the repeal of Persian restrictions, the elevation of Median cults, and most importantly, the moral satisfaction of humiliating their conquerors. This was not just a seizure of power. It was a cultural, ideological subversion aimed at undermining the very essence of Persian supremacy. But it was not only the Medians who were involved in this web of intrigue. Among the Persians themselves, in the highest echelons of power, there were those who were discontent, those whom Cambyses had alienated from the court, whose families had suffered from his insane purges, who saw the empire crumbling under his tyranny. For them, Gaumata, at first glance, offered stability, promising peace and prosperity. They may not have known his true identity, or preferred to turn a blind eye, seeing him as a lesser evil than the raging Cambyses. Their motives were pragmatic, to preserve their lands, their wealth, their influence, and ideally, to increase it under a new, more compliant regime. It was a dangerous dance on a razor's edge, where every step could lead either to immense riches or to the executioner's block. But every grand deception always finds its antagonist, and in this grand chess match, it was none other than Darius, son of Hystaspes, an Achaemenid, Cambyses' cousin, but at that time just one of many nobles, albeit holding the honorable position of royal spear-bearer. Darius was ambitious, perceptive, and most importantly, possessed an unshakable sense of his own dignity and legitimacy. He saw how Gaumata, this false Bardiya, usurped a throne that rightfully belonged to the Achaemenids. For Darius, this was not just a political crime. It was a desecration of the sacred royal lineage, a spit in the face of his ancestors. His motivation was multifaceted: to restore legitimate power, to reclaim the dynasty's honor, and of course, to secure his place in history. He could not tolerate an impostor occupying the Achaemenid throne, undermining the very foundations of the empire. Around Darius began to gather other great Persian nobles, the very 7 whose names would forever enter history as saviors of the empire, or perhaps as new usurpers, albeit under the guise of legitimacy. Among them was Otanes, father of Fatima, one of Bardiya's wives. Otanes, a wise and influential man, found himself at the center of this drama not only for political reasons, but also due to a deeply personal tragedy. His daughter, Fatima, was locked in the palace, deprived of communication, and it was through her silence, or, conversely, through her insight, that the impostor's terrible secret could be revealed. These 7, each with their own history, their own grievances against Cambyses, their own vision for Persia's future, but united by a common goal, represented a formidable force. Their secret meetings, their cautious whispers in the dark, their mutual checks for loyalty, all created a nervous, suffocating tension, foretelling an inevitable conflict. The game was for survival, where any wrong word, any glance could cost a head, and the stakes were higher than ever. The future of the world's greatest empire. And while Gaumata reveled in his illusory power, oblivious to the gathering storm clouds, the thread of conspiracy was already being woven in the shadows of palace intrigues, ready to become a noose around his neck. The fate of the empire hung by a thread, and the denouement was inevitable. The deep, scandalous, dramatic story of the Median Magus Gaumata, this genius of deception, was nearing its inevitable end. The greatest fraud of the Persian Empire, meticulously planned and audaciously executed, hung over an abyss, and the thread on which it held was thinning with each passing hour. While Gaumata, intoxicated by boundless power, reveled in his triumph within the impregnable fortress of Sikyovati in Media, a web of genuine conspiracy was already being spun outside the palace walls. 7 of the greatest Persian nobles, led by the indomitable Darius, son of Hystaspes, and the astute Otanes, Fatima's father, were preparing to strike. They were united not only by a thirst for justice and loyalty to the Achaemenid dynasty, but also by a deep revulsion for the brazen usurpation that had defiled the sanctity of the royal lineage. Gaumata's fate was decided not in lavish halls, but in the quiet rooms where Bardiya's confined wives languished in ignorance. Fatima, Otanes' daughter, was the Ariadne's thread that led the conspirators out of the labyrinth of deceit. Gaumata, in his paranoid attempt to conceal the truth, kept her and the other wives in the strictest isolation, forbidding them even to see the faces of their own handmaidens. But this very isolation became his curse. Otanes, a genius of strategic thinking, devised a cunning plan. He instructed Fatima, when Gaumata entered her chambers, to try and feel for his ears. Why ears? Because the real Bardiya was flawless, while the Median Magus Gaumata, according to legend, had had them severed years ago on Cambyses' order for some offense. This physical defect, which Gaumata meticulously concealed under a voluminous hairstyle and head coverings, was the only thing that could not be faked. And so, the moment of truth arrived. In the dim light of the chambers, as the impostor approached, Fatima, trembling with fear but driven by desperation, reached out. Her fingers glided over his head, feeling an unevenness, an emptiness where ears should have been. A shiver ran through her body. The truth was exposed. That very night, through a loyal servant, she conveyed this horrifying news to her father. He has no ears. This message became a death sentence, The conspirators, having received irrefutable proof, could no longer delay. Every moment of hesitation increased the risk of exposure. Gaumata, despite his initial luck, was becoming increasingly overconfident. His arrogance, previously hidden behind a mask of mercy, began to show. He believed his deception was absolute, that no one would dare question his divine right. But it was in this blind confidence that his final, fatal error lay. Darius, wasting no time, gathered his comrades. They decided to act immediately, while Gaumata was in Sikyavati, far from the main garrisons in the capital. It was a risky operation. Storming a citadel where the king resided would be tantamount to suicide if their plan failed. But Darius was not one to flinch in the face of danger. His gaze burned with determination, and every word he spoke was a call to a holy war for the honor of the Achaemenids. Under the cover of night, like shadows, the 7 conspirators crept towards the fortress. Inside, only a few of Gaumata's loyal servants awaited them, those who were privy to his secret, or simply blindly believed his lie. The atmosphere was electrified. Every rustle seemed a harbinger of disaster. They moved silently through the corridors, hearts pounding in their chests, ready to burst. Their target was the impostors' sleeping quarters. When the door burst open, Gaumata was caught off guard. He had likely just woken or was preparing for sleep. His royal robes were carelessly thrown on, and the voluminous hairstyle concealing his shame might have been disheveled. In his eyes, not terror, but rather shock, then fury, was instantly readable. He was exposed. The greatest fraud in Persia collapsed in an instant. Sources describe this scene as a brief but furious struggle. Gaumata, despite being a Magus and not a warrior, resisted desperately, understanding that this was the end. He grabbed a bow, but the string broke, as if fate itself had turned away from him. He lunged for the door, trying to escape, but Darius blocked his path. A struggle ensued between them. Perhaps Gaumata, in a last attempt to save himself, tried to appeal to his gods or his supposed royal blood, but his words were drowned out by the clash of steel. Gaumata's final moments must have been filled with the unbearable realization of the collapse of everything he had built. He, who had so masterfully played on the fears and hopes of millions, now faced absolute horror himself. Perhaps his last thought was of Fatima, of how one small detail, one touch, had destroyed his grand design. Or perhaps he cursed Cambyses, whose recklessness had created him, Gaumata, but whose death had condemned him to this end. In his eyes, probably reflected not only pain, but also deep disappointment that his brilliant lie had not lasted longer. He fell at Darius's hand, in the heat of a desperate struggle, his body collapsing to the floor, a symbol of the greatest deception that had ever shaken the Persian Empire. His death was not merely the end of one man, but the culmination of a grand drama where the very existence of the empire was at stake. But even after his fall, Gaumata's shadow would long hover over Persia, reminding of the fragility of truth and the ease with which the masses can be deceived. And this, my dear viewers, is just one of the countless facets of human nature that history continues to relentlessly expose. The story of Gaumata, this Median Magus who managed to deceive an entire empire, is not just a dusty chronicle of bygone days. It is an ominous mirror reflecting our own, painfully familiar reality. For has human nature changed since Darius plunged his dagger into the impostor's heart in Sikyavati? The lesson Gaumata teaches us is terrifying in its simplicity. Power over the masses is often achieved not by force of arms, but by force of narrative. He offered the people what they desperately craved: peace, tax abolition, hope. He became a symbol of relief after Cambyses' tyranny. And do we not see today how the same mechanisms are launched again and again? Recall populist politicians, soaring on waves of public discontent, promising golden mountains, instant solutions to all problems. They, like Gaumata, play on the strings of our deepest desires, be it economic prosperity, security, or the illusion of control. Or look at the greatest fraudsters of our time. From financial geniuses who built pyramids on trust, to creators of supposed technological breakthroughs that turned out to be mere smoke and mirrors. What do Elizabeth Holmes, who promised a revolution in medicine, or the organizers of the Fire Festival, who sold a dream of a luxurious paradise, have in common with the Median Magus? They are all masters of illusion. They sell not a product, but a story. They use charisma, the ability to read a crowd, to manage information, to create an appearance of legitimacy, and most importantly, to exploit our readiness to believe in what seems too good to be true. Gaumata controlled access to information, isolated those who could expose him, and generously rewarded those willing to turn a blind eye to the truth. Today, these methods have merely adopted new, digital forms. Fake news, carefully constructed media images, social media echo chambers where any alternative viewpoint is drowned out. Lies, amplified by algorithms, become indistinguishable from truth, and a convenient, yet false reality displaces inconvenient truth. And if it was so easy to deceive the ancient Persians, who had no internet, no global news, and no instant fact-checking, how vulnerable are we? We, living in an age of information overload, where millions of voices daily compete for our attention, offering their truths. How willing are we to abandon critical thinking for a comfortable lie? Are we capable of recognizing a new Gaumata when he comes, not with a royal title, but with a perfect social media account and promises that take our breath away? Or are we, just like millennia ago, doomed to believe in mirages created by those who know how to sell us our own desires? For behind every great deception lies not only the skill of the deceiver, but also a complex network of relationships, motives, and hidden interests, revealing something deeper about the nature of society itself.